Adina, um, I found that one of the most moving elements of the book for me, and I expect for a lot of other readers, is the way that you really honor and build upon your mother's work. You refer to her pretty consistently, and you dedicate the book to her. She's obviously an enormous influence on you, and so since that's such a foundation, I'd love to start by asking you to tell us about your mother's pioneering work in art therapy and how that was part of your life growing up and how it influenced your spiritual formation.
Absolutely. Thank you. I just want to say hi first to everyone and just thank you for being here. Thank you for having me, Josh and IJS, and thank you, Rebecca, for that beautiful introduction. And I feel really grateful to have one of your paintings on our dining room downstairs and to have been so supported by IJS over the years. So just lots of nice intersections of JSP and IJS, and just thank you everyone for being here. It feels really nice to start the conversation with my mom because that really is where all the work comes from. And I have to say, I'm in the middle of leading, I told you when we got started, right now, a 5-day retreat for our creative facilitator training, co-leading with my mom. So I'm just coming out of the studio where we were creating alongside 20 other people. So it feels very fresh and like resonant in this moment. As Rebecca said, I say I grew up in an art studio. That really does feel true. The studio was the biggest room in our house growing up. And that was like already it's a rare thing, but certainly in suburban Chicago with, I think what Hemingway said, the town of broad lawns and narrow minds, which I would not say categorized as Oak Park. I think it was a beautiful place to grow up, but definitely manicured in many ways. And to have the studio be the biggest room in the house, a place of mess, a place of exploration, a place of rawness, a place of realness. At least that's how this studio was. There were marks on the walls, there were pieces in process, there were jars of paint and like bones and found objects and shards of mirrors and things that had fallen apart to be repurposed and reused and made into something else. So that's one thing. And then I grew up in my mom's public studios that she and her colleagues created called the Open Studio Project, from which our work derives. So I grew up going to these public studios. The first one opened in Wicker Park in Chicago before Wicker Park became what it is now. And I grew up just as a kid going there and making art alongside mostly adults who were just deep in their own process and just getting to do that alongside one another. My mom's work, it started really as a challenge to the field of art therapy around the clinification of the field, and was a way of letting the art therapist really bring their artist self into the room. That's how she describes it. And moving away from let the art therapist interpret and tell you what your art means, and rather the therapist and client create art alongside one another and a space for the client to decipher what their own art means. So she created the Open Studio project and the Open Studio process. That process is now used all over the world and has been adapted to many different cultural contexts, from Taiwan to Mexico to India, and many. And I would say the Jewish studio process is maybe one of the most sort of evolved cultural adaptations of that process.
Hmm.
Go from there.
Great. Um, so I want to move hover a little bit more on this question of like the relational nature, right? Of because the relationship with your mom and the relational nature of the art therapy and the sort of studio process itself. Um, there's a passage pretty early in the book, I think it's on page 37, where I was struck by the way, yeah, you talk about um, the roots of the roots of the word Torah, right, and the meanings and the cognates of the word Torah, and so its connection to the word morim, or morot, teachers, right, and horim, parents. And you talk about being in relationship in and through Torah, which is a topic I've also been interested in for a long time. How do you think about and talk about your relationship with Torah, how it's evolved, how it's changed, and what do you say to people who might feel intimidated or feel like they have to struggle to find a healthy relationship with Torah?
Yeah, thanks for that. Um, I'm trying to move from my mom to Torah, and then I'm sure we'll circle back to my mom at some point. Um, Yeah, I write in the beginning of the book a story about the Shema, and about feeling like the power of just the 6 words of the Shema, of saying it. I grew up in a reform setting. I sort of was taught, say these words when every night before you go to sleep, and I said them in Hebrew every night, and they felt like a totem, like something that could keep me safe. It's felt like there was real like energy and power in the Hebrew of that Torah. And then I would get to synagogue and we would say the English, like Hero Israel, sort of that classic, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. And it never felt totally alive. And so I would say with that piece of Torah, it wasn't until I learned um, other interpretations of what those words could mean that helped me to see that within Torah are so many possible interpretations, that listen could also be Shema is here. And one isn't just like solitary alone, but echad could be oneness, the interconnection of all beings. And Yisrael isn't just Israel, the people Israel, a place Israel. Israel is Yisrael and struggling with God. And so many teachers who came before me who helped to open those up, I think gave me an inkling that, oh, like these words of Torah, which maybe is something that many people on this screen have had, maybe not, but that inkling that there's so much packed into these words, both has been uncovered before us and that has yet to be uncovered. And one of the images I used was of a painting that has accrued layer after layer for, each of these interpretations have served in their time. They've been needed out of safety or out of assimilation or out of whatever need those interpretations arose. But when we can peel back layers and when we're given both permission and also the tools to do so, I think those Hebrew words are just like vibrating with potential and with meaning.
Mm.
And I would say we're all invited into that project of co-creating the ongoing meaning of Torah. I feel Torah, we say Torah in Jewish tradition, right, is an Eitz Chaim, is a living, breathing tree. And I think she only is that and can be that when we bring our life force energy to that text. So it lives and breathes through us. And it wants to grow and branch and blossom and have some fruit drop and new, leaves bloom. And I think we are how Torah does that. And to say, yeah, to feel alienated from, disconnected from, to never have been permission or tools or encouragement to do that is really real. So if anything tonight, just want to open up permission, encouragement, and just say that Torah, I feel like Torah expands for me the more voices that are brought into conversation with it. And so that feels like something that can be all of our project, and I hope that it can be.
And I think that's also like that's good, very you make it very clear like that's also that approach to Torah is so related to the approach to art making, that you have also, which is like, you do not um this isn't about mastery, or and just even doing away sort of with the notion of mastery. I don't want to say, well, actually, maybe I'll let you, I don't want to answer that question for you, but like that's something that a lot of us think about, right? I mean, we go to the museum, we go to, we as part of our growing up, we lose or we are schooled out of just picking up and drawing, right? And we think we have to be good at it. Oh, I'm not good at it, so I don't do that anymore. And in Jewish studio process, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, is an invitation to rediscover that, but it's also an invitation to rediscover, our relationship with Torah. So maybe I'll ask you here, though, how do you think about or how do you respond to the question of like, where is expertise or mastery, right? In both in Torah and in art making, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess I'd say like, what's your intention? What are you trying to do? So I think Torah can be used for all kinds of things, and so can art. Many of them useful and good. And so in the particular process that I use, there's a particular goal and intention. Um, and I would say mastery is about finding where where the words resonate in us, and finding mastery in listening to that inner voice and what wants to come through. As you're just bringing up trauma with Torah, or like, bad memories of interaction with Torah, bad memories of interaction with art. I sometimes joke that for Jewish Studio Project, when my spouse and I were bringing forth this organization, it was like, let's take the two things that people have the most pain and suffering around, art making and Torah, And let's add in a mother-daughter relationship. That'll really, and people will definitely want to come and do this thing. But it is interesting that these two things that have so much pain, bringing for so many people, not everyone, but bringing them together has been so incredibly healing and generative. And in this retreat, in this training that I was just doing today, we were brainstorming sort of so the Jewish studio process brings together Beit Midrash, the process of textual inquiry that we've inherited from Jewish tradition, together with the open studio process of intention setting, art making, and witness writing. So I was really interested in rabbinical school I fell in love with Beit Midrash, I fell in love with Torah study, and felt like the information really stayed from here up. Seems like that resonates maybe with many people on the screen. And I know so much of what your work is and IJS's work is like, how do we get that to drop in and drop down and help ourselves drop in and drop down so it can actually have a real effect on us and on the world? And so I think there's many ways to do that. I think meditation, song, there's so many ways. I was experimenting with what happens when we bring this art method that I grew up doing into the Beit Midrash as a way to elongate our relationship with the text so that the text can continue to work on us. If you think about the art making in this process as like a moving meditation, like we're using materials as a moving meditation. And then at the end, we're writing in response to it. And so often new synapses have fired, new interactions, new connections that would never have been available to solely to the intellectual mind. So what's underneath the intellectual surface? And I would say in Jewish tradition, for the most part, we're really practiced at the intellect. And I would say the intellect gets a seat at the table. That's something that feels really important to me about this process, that it's not about push the intellect aside, it has nothing to offer. But how do we begin to reweave and remarry those DNA strands of who we are as human beings, the intellect, together with intuition and imagination. And I think that other side is what's been sort of foreclosed or not as supported. And so how do we hold intellect there and then reweave these strands? So yeah, and it's been fascinating and beautiful to see the way the text can take root in the self and the new Torah that comes out by bringing this process in. And I don't know if I circled back to your question, so remind me.
No. That's. I mean, I was asking about expertise, right? And because I think that that's such a challenge, like in the age that we live in, right? There is, on the one hand, there's seeming democratization of voices, right? Everybody has one of these, and and with that, you feel like you can proclaim to the world. And on the other hand, there's a real challenge in that democratization of, so where is expertise, right? And how does expertise matter? And so yeah, so I will, yeah, if you want to just respond to that, I'm
Yeah,
curious.
thank you. Yeah, so again, expertise in what and for what. I think
Right.
there are times when expertise in all of the biblical commentators and when they came at what time period, like that's really needed and we can draw on that. There's times when halakha, Jewish law, and how do all these passages of Torah lead into Jewish law today is really needed. So yeah, I would say in this process, what's interesting to me and what I'm seeking to cultivate is how do we bring our expertise of our lived life experience to Torah? And that feels like a real practice. So how do we bring our expertise as a mother, as a farmer, as an artist, as all the many identities and experiences and pains and joys that we've had? How do we bring them into conversation with the text so that something that has never come before and will never come again can arise in this moment? That's what I'm interested in. And
Yeah.
something that's resonant, both for us and for other people. And so
Yeah.
I think that requires, a really deep practice and a deep expertise. Just like you could say maybe with meditation, right? You're just sitting. Like, what are you getting expert in? Like, sit there, right? But as anybody on the screen knows, it takes a real practice, a real dedication to practice and expertise to go to that inner place.
Yeah. The second half, well, actually, before we get to that, you started to describe the Jewish studio process, but I want to give you a chance. I mean, you have a chapter devoted to it, but for those who aren't familiar, maybe you wanted to say a little more about so somebody who hasn't been to one of your programs, what does this actually look like? This sounds so interesting, but I need like a little more, paint me a picture, if you
Nice.
would.
Sure. So in its most, I don't know, pure form, maybe we're starting with spiritual grounding, just coming into the room, coming into relationship. We're starting with the text, Beit Midrash. Usually it's a short line of text. There's questions. meant to help us unlock both our own life experience, the text where the two meet, to get into touch with our chavruta, Beit Midrash, right? Textual inquiry. And then we're moving into a process, as I said, of intention setting, art making, and witness writing. So the intention setting is a bridge from the Torah study where we move from that place of activation, excitement, ideas. We've challenged each other. We've uncovered new meanings, like cool. Okay, now I get quiet in myself and see like what's really live for me in this, beyond what's like interesting, beyond what was really felt like a really smart thing to say. Like, where does this actually feel like there's something snagging me? There's something painful for me. There's something generative that I want to explore. And then that becomes our intention for art making. Often we say intention, but also like what's in tension? What is still intention in me that wants to be explored? We write that down on our page and then we say, set it and forget it. You kind of set your intention. You imagine it as though it's a prayer that's already been answered, put it aside, and then move into any kind of exploration using art materials that you want. The rules of the JSP studio are follow pleasure, which maybe seems we could have a whole other webinar on that. What does it mean to follow pleasure, follow the energy within the parameters of a given experience, to notice what moves us and to allow ourselves to follow that? No comment, so that there's no commenting on anyone else's or your own piece, even and especially to say how much you love it and how amazing they are as an artist. This is because I don't think most of us have been in an art space ever where we weren't commented on, where the art making wasn't about some outside person's approval or opinion on what we made. And so how do we get to reclaim these materials for ourselves as a practice of exploration and introspection? The other two rules are notice everything. It's all part of the process, just like with meditation, right? The resistance, the annoyance, the person next to you breathing too loud, that you can't concentrate and get into a flow, right? All of that is part of the process. And keep going, stay with it for the full amount of time, because we're always surprised by what happens when we kind of go past that maybe initial point of boredom or resistance and see what's there. So art making. And then there's a practice called witnessing, witness writing. That's really a free write in response to both the piece and the process, keeping the pen moving, seeing what comes. And then there's a sort of ritually held space, if we do this in community, where people are invited but not required to read some piece of their witness out loud, which isn't an explanation or a telling about. It's really a ritual moment of reading from what's been written on the page. And then we close. So as you can see behind me, these are all, and this is not all of them, but pieces from doing the Jewish studio process, mostly on Zoom with people and things that have emerged. And each one is like a touchstone for me to a particular text or a particular time, to things that were going on in the community that I made them with. And I keep them here behind me as like my sort of brain soul exploded on the wall behind me.
Wow. Beautiful. Thank you. So I was particularly drawn. I mean, I love the whole book. The second half of the book, for me, spoke to me the most because it was it's a series of five like really, I thought, very creative and rich and moving explorations of creativity and Torah. Um, and in there you go through concepts of, our creation as creative beings and creations, as B'Tselem Elohim, creations in the image of God. Tohu vavohu, the sort of potentialities of chaos, right? The divine as process, and the Talmudic encouragement, lahafoch ba, right, to turn it and turn it, that comes from Pirkei Avot. And since we're talking while we're in the Torah reading cycle of reading about Abraham and Sarah, right, we're in Parshat Vayera. I'd love to delve a little into there's the fifth essay. It's not in order, but the fifth chapter that I didn't mention is on Lech Lecha, the concept of Lech Lecha, of journeying and going forward, um, and there's an observation you had on page 142 that I would love to invite you to read about the beginning of their journey of Avram and Sarah, and that they seemingly, stop and give up, and it's precisely then that Abraham hears this call to keep going. So I'd love to invite you to read that for us, and just reflect on what do you think what does that have to say to us, at this moment?
Thanks, Josh. Okay, I'll start at just the way bottom of 141, because I think that's where that section starts.
Yeah.
Okay. There are particular moments in our life when we can perhaps hear this call, this Lech Lecha call, more readily. We may imagine that these are moments of courage and strength on our part, when we feel most competent and confident in embarking on a new challenge. However, the Torah offers a different, perhaps even opposite perspective. When Avram hears the call of Lach Lecha, he is in a period of frustration, stagnation, and loss. His father, Terach, has just passed away. His wife, Sarai, could not conceive, and the couple had no children. At 75 years old, the life that he had hoped for no longer seemed possible. Just a few verses before Lech Lecha, we read that Sarai and Avram, quote, set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans for the land of Canaan. But when they had come as far as Haran, they settled there. The meaning of the phrase settled there, Vayeshvu Sham, is that they ceased traveling and set up camp in Haran. Yet in these words, we also hear another meaning of the word settle, to accept or agree to something that is less than satisfactory. We can imagine Avram and Sarai, tired from the waiting and wandering, simply deciding to settle where they were on their journey. It is precisely at this moment that Avram heard that generative call of Lach Lecha, not when the map was well marked and clear, but when he had given up on the journey altogether. He hears it in a place of stagnation, perhaps even frustration. Lach Lecha comes to remind us that nothing is final, that there is always the potential for change. Even when we have settled for something, and perhaps especially in these moments, there's a force in the universe calling us towards vitality and new life. It is from here, from that jumble of discontent and desire, that the divine so often speaks.
You could just do a mic drop at that point if you wanted. But I do wonder, as you're reading that, I mean, you wrote that presumably, a year or more ago. And so I'm just wondering for you in this moment, which can be, it can be in whatever context. And we have so much has changed in a year.
Yeah.
And to me anyway, reading that recently landed with a sense of, oh wow, this is like, yeah, there's like some there's some really deep work to do here. I'm wondering how it is for you.
I would love to hear more where it led you, if you want to say more about that, and then I'm happy to share.
Well, I'm thinking in the context of everything that's been going on, since October 7th, Jewishly, and how talk about like just where that has led and the amount of devastation and heartache and pain and suffering. Um, and not clear where the light at the end of that, is.
Yeah.
And then there, in the immediate context here of the election, and that's obviously a huge change. And I don't want to make any assumption about anyone's politics on in the Zoom room right now. But it is an enormous change, and at a minimum. And so, and for me anyway, lands with, okay, well, this feels like it's going to be reality for the next 4 years at least. And I heard in it sort of an invitation to remember that, like, actually, right? No, nothing is ever done, right? Nothing is fully baked. Nothing is finished, and that it's always moving, and new possibilities always opening up. But sometimes when that's raw, it can feel really hard to access that generative place.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Amen. Yeah, I think in reading Avram and Sarai's story, it reminds me of like, it's never something that we're choosing. They didn't choose any of those things, the barrenness or the father dying or any of the, right?
Right.
We don't choose hardship. These things are just things that inevitably, by being human, that we have to deal with. But that this offers us the idea that that call of Lech Lecha is always issuing to each one of us. And I invite all of us to read ourselves as Avram, that's not one special person. And the rabbis, play on that of saying like, why Avram? He was just a guy. It's like, yeah, we're all just people. And to be able to imagine to know that call of Lech Lecha is issuing forth at all times to all of us. I think there's another passage I speak about where the rabbi say that call was coming for so long, and Avram didn't hear it until that moment. And so sometimes it isn't until we are at a loss. We do feel that stagnation and frustration that we are open to hearing where we're being called towards next. And we can't individually and also, unfortunately, collectively. I don't think we can skip that step no matter how hard I would love us to, or we might try. I think, yeah, the pain and the loss and the stagnation and frustration, like if I think about like the evolution of human consciousness, it's not opening to the next level. And the only way out is through. I guess that's what was coming. And if we could avoid all of that, we would, and I wish we could, and I don't think we can. But to think that call of Lech Lecha also, I spend some time going with the Lecha of Lech Lecha, like why the Lecha, and all the different midrashim, the rabbinic interpretations of why, but that it feels really important, especially at this time to me, that it's both a call out, like Lech, go, and it's a call in, like Lecha, to ourselves and for ourselves. I think often in moments of upheaval and chaos, we just only look outward of like, what's the change we need to make out there in the world? And I think this is probably something that really resonates with IJS's work as well, right? We do the outer work and the inner work, and the two are never separate from one another. And I really love that about the Lech Lecha call, that it's Lech and Lecha, they're both held there together. And that it's a call to each one of us. And I don't think the work or consciousness or any of that can move forward until we each answer that call. Like we are each needed in this task. There is not some savior. There is not some Avram who's going to do it all for us. It's like, it's us. It's all of us here. We're going to do that individually and then together.
We've had a couple of questions come in, and I want to remind folks, if you'd like to send a question, just to send it to Q&A in the chat. So one of these you actually addressed directly, and I don't remember the page, but you might, which is we have a couple of questions about just beginner's mind and the relationship of beginner's mind and art practice. And and so I definitely remember reading that passage. I don't remember at the moment like what page it was on, but if you want to say a little more, because obviously that is another sort of shared concept here that comes up a lot in our work and in your work.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that question. So one of the passages, as you know, that I spend a lot of time with is just the opening words of Genesis that we read, now a couple of weeks ago, but Breshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created. And I bring in an interpretation from our dear friend and colleague, Rabbi B'nai Lappi, who I was once studying this passage with, who was like
another Chicagoan,
another Chicagoan and rabbi and creator. She was asking, we were exploring, what does Bereshit mean? And the rabbis are troubled by this. It doesn't mean in the beginning. Be, is that like, what's the right word? Prepositional or whatever that's called?
Yeah.
It's that, right? That means with, by means, or through. And Reshit really means first. And so what is it with or by means of the first, through the first? And she was like, what if it means like through the first way of seeing or encountering things, God created the world. With beginner's mind, God created the world. And that really stuck with me and has become part of my theology, I think, because the dominant view of God, at least that I have been given, is that God is all-powerful, master, has a plan, executes it step by step perfectly. And I think that may be appealing to some, and I think we should hold that interpretation there and add to the soup of meanings. Also, maybe it means that God created with beginner's mind. Maybe God had no idea and was following each next impulse as it came and exploring, co-creating with the materials and seeing what was going to emerge and then responding from that to create what was next. So first of all, just to say, it helps me to be able to say, if we're human beings created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of the divine, what does that mean? Who is the divine? So I want to be able to see God, at least in part, as one who creates with beginner's mind, because then it invites me into the practice of creating with beginner's mind. And actually, in this retreat that I spoke of, we were just looking at beginner's mind and the concept of Shoshin from Zen Buddhism, and that it's really about an attitude of openness and eagerness. So it's not, I guess, just to say it's not about having to forget or like disregard or keep at bay all of the beautiful knowledge that we all have, because I think that's really important to not forget and to bring to the table as well. But how do we do that with an attitude of openness and eagerness of like what new is going to arise today? Mm-hmm. And so I find that, this passage, Breshit or Lech Lecha, I've been teaching, talking about it for, 2 decades or whatever, how do any of us come to that thing that we become practiced at, that we are good at, do that, but come to it with an attitude of openness and eagerness to like, what new can I encounter in this today?
Yeah, beautiful. Um, I think that actually it goes into the second question, which is a question that we talked about a little bit before, but we've had a couple of people ask, okay, I hear that you want me to do this, but like I've got this mental block where I've got some voice in me that says, you're not creative, you're not good at art, etc. Um, what do you say to people when that's often probably imagine the number one objection that people raise?
I was going to say, I've never heard that before. Yeah. If anything, JSP is a pastoral project around helping us all reconnect to our creativity. And first of all, to say creativity, as I talk about in the book, and art are different, right? We can bring our creativity, can be manifest in all kinds of ways. The way we create a spreadsheet, the way we organize a staff meeting, the way we parent our children, right? Creativity is like that. But I would say that working in the arts, with art materials, different artistic disciplines, can be a way to cultivate a relationship to our creativity. And I guess why I feel invested in that is, yeah, there's so much shame tied up in that. I think I often tell the story that we do a lot of professional development at JSP with all different, across the Jewish ecosystem with organizations and staffs and boards. And you ask at the beginning, who feels like they're, or have been told by a third grade art teacher or someone in your life, even a well-meaning adult, that you are not creative, put down the paintbrush and stick to something that you're good at. And inevitably 90% of the room raises their hands and the other 10% are just like embarrassed, but have the same story. Whether you were told to like mouth the words in choir or you were told to put the paintbrush down. It's just, first of all, just interesting to note. There's a lot of things that we're not like expert at that we still do. Like, we're not Top Chef, but we still cook dinner. We're not going to climb Mount Everest, but we still walk in the woods. So just to say, like, art can be like that too. But I think from a very young age, maybe like after preschool, it's like when you create things, the teacher says like, this is good or this is bad, or you like followed this prompt or you didn't, or yours gets hung on the wall or it doesn't, or on the fridge or it doesn't, and you get the message. So I guess what I want to offer is that these materials can also be used in other ways than like creating art for a museum or art to be sold. And not to say that that isn't powerful and important. Creating culture through art is extremely important, but markers, pens, paints, our bodies, our voices can all be used as a form of exploration, and introspection can be used as a method of self-discovery, and can be used as a conduit to cultivate our relationship to the divine, which I think of as the creative force of the universe. So I think some things that can support that are like the no comment rule, for instance, to just like trust, like no one's going to come by and tell me I was good or bad or no. But yeah, it's a journey, but I want to just invite folks, even if it's just like on a tiny piece of paper and no one's ever going to see it, like create a space for yourself where you can start to explore and test and play and reclaim that power for yourself.
I think it's also reminds me of our teacher Rabbi Sheila Peltz Weinberg, was famous for saying on retreat, like, don't worry, you already have an A+ in meditation, right? Just like, it's not like there is a right way to do this, right? And you're going to need to do what's good for you. And there is a practice that you follow, and everybody, has to follow that, follows that practice and cultivates it for themselves. I think about, I'm looking at my Peloton, over in the other part of the room, and, exercise, is a similar thing. Like we all exercise, and 99.9% of us are not going to be, riding Tour de France. But that's not why that's not why I'm riding, right? It's not why I exercise. It's because I do what my body needs and is good for my body and helps me to feel good and stay healthy. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. One other thing came up as you were saying that, which was the phrase cross training, that I think about what are the qualities that are most needed in the world. And we would probably agree on many of these. An ability, again, not because we choose to, but because this is what life gives us. How do we learn how to be with the unknown? How do we learn how to tolerate complexity? How do we learn how to be with ambiguity? How do we learn to work with the shit, the chaos, the void that we encounter in the world, and like work it and fashion it and turn it into something new? So I guess the other thing I would say is that art making, at least in the practice I'm offering, is a cross-training method, right? You have no idea what's going to come out on the page. It's the unknown. inevitably, when you're working with materials, it gets to a point where everything looks horrible and you hate it. How do you stay with it and keep working it and working it and watch it evolve into something else? You know, and how do we do that in a low stakes way? It's a piece of paper and some color on a page, right? Ultimately, even though it feels pressure and we have that shame and that resistance, ultimately it's pretty low stakes. And how can cultivating that on the page help us take those capacities off the page and into the rest of our lives?
There's been we got two more questions that came in, and we got enough time that I think we can do them, and then I'm going to invite you to close with one more reflection from the book. So one question is, have people tried this process with music or other art forms? You're talking a lot about visual, but yeah, if you want to just comment on that.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things that's really been amazing about, we were just talking about moving to Zoom before we got on this call together, but one of the things that's been amazing about that, as opposed to being in a shared physical studio space together, is that every person gets to use whatever they want. Whereas in a studio space, if you start like playing on your saxophone, that's going to like disrupt my process, and I'm on drums and someone else is, right? There's like a cacophony. So something beautiful about Zoom, I think, is that each person, and I would say, yeah, a number of people at JSP who are musicians work with their voice, work with instruments, and new songs and nigunim and melodies have come through using this process. People have used just writing, like free writing, as the art making. People have used tending and weeding their garden. I've used the art of making a sandwich, because actually what I needed in that moment to follow pleasure in the middle of the workshop was to make myself food. And then you can witness that, right? We can derive meaning from anything that we're doing. So yeah, I think any modality can be used and has been used.
Yeah. And then one other question. This is a big one. How do we use how do we use art to connect to ourselves and to God?
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
That's what it's all
Um,
about.
yeah, so I guess just going back to sort of the beginning of those five passages, back to that Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created, and thinking of ourselves made in that image of the creative force. The thesis of this book is that each and every one of us are created creative, are created to create, and that being in touch with our creativity is the way that we access both that deep and powerful place within ourselves. But in my understanding and theology, it's when we are in touch with that place in ourselves that we're in touch with God, the divine, the creative source.
Mhm.
So I would say this practice for me, it's a spiritual practice, it's a prayer practice, it's a divination practice, you could say. But I think that when we are in touch with that deep seat of creative power in ourselves, we are in touch with God. And that is the way that we let God move to us and through us.
So I want to invite you to read the first paragraph of the conclusion here, which I think actually ties in beautifully with what you just said. Um, Yeah, and I think as we hear it, I think what I hear in it is that you're talking not just about sort of keeping going, but really about renewing ourselves. Um, one way to hear the Lech Lecha part, that Dvar Torah is to say, okay, when you hit rock bottom, okay, then that's the moment when something may come and you need and you keep going, or as the fourth rule in the Jewish studio process, right? Keep going. But I think it's not just about keeping going. I think what we'll hear in a second is you're saying something about renewing ourselves, and so let's read that, and then I want to just invite you to like reflect on how this Torah that you've helped to develop is it helps people to find that renewal, both as individuals and a community. But yeah, let's just read the beginning of the conclusion here.
Sure, just that first paragraph. And I just
Yeah,
have
I
to
think so. Yeah, yeah. Let's do that.
say, and just because it'll touch on this, but just to say, the place of all possibility, as you said, what a time to be coming out with a book called The Place of All Possibility.
Yeah.
um, so,
Yeah.
as ever, since this was written and before, we live in times of unprecedented challenge and change. From the political to the personal, it often feels like we're hitting a wall. Stuck in cycles of anxiety and exploitation, we face a crisis of imagination. We need new pathways to possibility. As a species and as a society, we've successfully cultivated our capacity for certainty and control, for separation and subjugation. Now, for our own sanity and the planet's survival, We need to cultivate our capacity for uncertainty, for openness, for connection to each other and all that unites us. We need to reclaim our inherent creativity as the seat of our deepest power.
Hmm. It's a pretty good manifesto. So how have you seen that play out? I wonder, either for yourself, for individuals, for community.
Yeah, I can just say, even for myself today in the studio doing this process, something had just come up about with my family, with my kid, that was making me really upset, really anxious, kind of depressed. And I was working on a piece that I've been working on the other day, and I'm putting marks on the page. I don't know what they mean. There's circles, there's spirals, there's lines, it's covered over, it's painted, it sucks, it's something new. I keep going, keep going. Um, and then as I'm writing my witness, like each of those lines started to speak to me, and the backdrop behind the piece started to speak to me. And then all of a sudden, it'd been very dark. It rained here in Berkeley. We're now in the rainy season. The studio had gotten very sort of dark and dim. And then all of a sudden, as I'm writing, like light starts like radiating through the windows onto the piece, and like I don't know, it was like God speaking through the piece, through the
Mm,
elements of the more than human world to me in that writing experience. And all of a sudden, God was like, lighten up. And it really helped move something, both, I think, the somatic experience of mark making, of art making that involves our body, that lets us take the energy that has accrued inside of us and kind of like release some of it and move some of it actually tangibly, physically. The process of dropping underneath like what on the surface we're angry or upset about, to get to like, where's that tender place? Where's that vulnerable place? Where's that place of love and connection that always exists under every layer of harm and hurt? There is always a tender, vulnerable, loving place. And the art making can be a way to get there. And then to use my writing practice as a way to let God kind of speak to me through my piece, through the sunlight, through the shade, to what I was needing in the moment. So that's just like one tiny example, but I think that this process allows all of us both to work with text and uncover new meaning, and to work with the mess, the disarray, the disappointment, the harm, the hurt, the disconnection that we experience in our lives, and to work it, as you said, hafochba, to turn it, just the way an artist, all of us creators, can work and work and work both emotional material and the physical materials, right? The two kind of go hand in hand. To let ourselves squeeze out of it, wring out of it, like what is actually the kernel of truth that is needed to move us to what's next.
mm. That's a great place to stop, I think. Adina, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for writing this book. The book is The Place of All Possibility. I highly, highly, highly recommend. And big shout out to our friends at Ayin Press also for publishing it, and it's a beautiful book, and it's like it fits in your hand beautifully, and it's like the right, sort of weight, and it's a nice book to spend time with. So thank you, and we will we'll look forward to even more things to come in the way of art and Torah and all the good things that the Jewish Studio Project is doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, gonna
Thank
bring
you so
Rebecca.
much. Oh,
I'm
can I
gonna
just
bring Rebecca
say,
back. Go ahead. Yeah.
thank you, Josh. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, IJS. And thank you, everyone who took time out of your precious lives and evenings, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are, to be with us. And I hope that tonight, together, gathering, we opened up a portal to more possibility, more creativity, more curiosity, and more joy, because each of us can be conduits for that, in our own little lives and in our big collective life. So thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you.